Welcome to the channel. My name is Dan. Subscribe, like, and let's go. Okay, today we're taking a look at Detail Magazine, issue October 2021. And the actual project that we are doing is not in this preview that I'm showing you, but it's very similar to a detail like this. The one we are doing is from page 53 of this issue, but once again, it's not in this preview that I'm flipping through virtually for you. Okay, so this is the structure we're going to be detailing today. It's kind of a cool one. You can find all these images in ArcDaily, as well as Detail Magazine. So JKMM are the architects, and they did this project in Finland. It's called Fiery Library. I hope I'm saying that right. Fyyri, and it's in Finland. This is a good view of the section we're going to be going through today. So we have on the top copper cladding, below that a curtain wall, and then granite pavers. And here's a better shot of that image as well. And you'll see that there's an awning there with acoustical panels that extend from the inside to the outside to provide some shelter for that patio. Interiors, just to give you a sense, concrete that's polished in white. A couple sections. Then we're going to end here with the detail that we're actually going to be detailing out in Revit today. And so here's the detail, and this is from Detail Magazine. It's a little excerpt of that, modified slightly, scanned it. I threw in the break lines, so that way it's a little bit more clear where the drawing breaks for you. And this is the detail we're doing in Revit. Let's do it. Okay, so I got the video going in about double speed here, but I drew up a massing model of the structure based on some images that I brought in from ArcDaily, scaled them, drew a section line. From that section line, you can create crop boxes to just split up the section. So that way it's you can just focus on the top and the bottom of this detail and fit more on the page in a larger scale. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through and show you the composition that I have for the floors and roofs and soffit, all the different main massings that are going to make up our detail. So I would just pause the video on these different spots if you want to take a closer look or a longer look. And we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about them right now because that's something that is pretty self-explanatory when you pause the video. Right here, what I'm doing is I'm going into the curtain wall and I'm unpinning different features. And when you unpin them, then you can edit type, you can duplicate them, and you can manipulate them a lot more. So if you're unfamiliar with how curtain walls are done in Revit, there are a bunch of different components that are pinned down by default. And if you unpin them, then you can easily edit them and save them as a different type, and then edit the composition to have the new types that you just edited. So here I'm showing how I made the a black aluminum framing for the curtain wall. All right. And I also create a aluminum section pattern on that. So if you looked at that video again, if you rewind, you'll see I did the graphic on that. The floor, this is the exterior patio. So this is the composition of that. Got 3 inches of rough cut granite. And right now I'm just throwing in some different cut patterns, some hatching patterns for any time there's a section on these different materials, and just checking some different things here. Once again, pause the video if you'd like to take a closer look. This is the interior floor. It's going to have some extra details in it a little bit later. There's a trench around the perimeter of this structure with some radiant heat piping. Foundation, footing, just so you can see the sizes. And these are approximates. The detail from Detail Magazine is shown in millimeters, and so I just did the closest imperial measurement to those metric measurements. So navigating over, you can see this folders I'm going through to get the cross section for the steel framing here. And you'll see that my initial choice that I pick here is going to be a little on the small side for the cross section, the girder that these beams tie into, and I update that a little bit later in the video. But here I'm looking for something close to a 12-inch depth. And I'm throwing that section here, but if you compare it to the detail on the right, you'll see that that section needs to be larger than the beam tying into it. So that was something that I missed. And let's see. The detail patterns that you see in Detail Magazine for the hatching pattern for insulation, they use this zigzag. I'm using an orthographic like cross hatching. Doesn't matter which one you go with. Normally, the one that I'm choosing is more so represents a rigid foam material for what I'm familiar with. And then I usually use more of a like a batt insulation pattern for any kind of fiberglass or wool fill. They use the same insulation pattern regardless in Detail Magazine from what I've been picking up on. But just make sure you stay consistent with what you're trying to illustrate. So this beam that I chose here is correct. The one that's the long side of the beam, but once again, my cross section was a size a little too small. And here I'm updating that. So one of the trickier things about detailing in Revit is making sure that you're being fast and efficient with your time and that you don't have a bunch of rework. So the more you can use the pre-populated detail components, the better. But sometimes it might be faster to just sketch out what you need or do a masking region or a filled region on what you need. So it kind of just depends on what workflow works best for you and how large the project is. Here what I'm doing is I'm making a masking region, I believe, just right over the I-beam. So then that way it looks correct. And later I'm going to actually fill in that masking region as a filled region on the right side. And you'll see I throw that insulation in there in that cavity as they illustrate on the right. And here I just mirrored the initial masking region that I had on the right to the left, but I'm really just kind of rethinking it right now. And I'm using the align tool and I just reshaped the masking region to follow the angle of the beam. And then since the beam was already behind everything else, I just dragged it a little bit longer and then that got the correct cope on that beam. And here I just drew the plate. Most likely has like a welded or a through-bolted connection into that girder. There's my insulation hatching, ortho cross section. And now we're looking for the channels. They're like 3/4 inches thick. And so I'm going to go with the channel stud here. And that's used to just fur out underneath this steel. Most likely to help get the on-center spacing that the sheet good underneath it needs to have. Also, it creates a nice air gap and cavity to run potentially like electrical through. So here's that furring there, that channel. And I'm going to use the array command here. And I'm going to snap to the detail line above so I have something to grab onto. And I'm just doing like a 2 foot on center spacing, I believe, or something along that line. You'll see for the most part, the compositions of the walls and the floors and all the layers that I have put in, I try to use those graphics when I can, but in general, they kind of just help with the placement of the detail items, being able to reference widths and depths, but there's a lot of manipulation that's needed to help with the lapping. So to illustrate the actual drawings correctly, you have to still spend a decent amount of time. And here I chose a plywood cross-section hatching, but you know, I'm actually more of a fan of what Detail Magazine's using with just the vertical lines. It's a little bit less busy. Now with detail line here, I'm just going straight up and I'm drawing in the wall that exists above this curtain wall that is inside this eaved area, the soffit. However, I could have done that with a regular wall. I ended up at the end of the whole project drawing in a wall above the curtain wall anyways, but this is just another way to show how to do that. And I drew those two detail lines, and then I thought, you know, I'm just going to place a metal stud in here instead. And so that's what I'm coming back to do here. What's nice about doing it this way is it already creates the masking that I needed. And now I'm realizing that, this soffit here, the insulation is not going to carry through to the interior, and I'm better off bringing back, well, I'm throwing in the insulation first, but I'm going to end up bringing back with the cut profile command. So view cut profile, these different pieces of insulation. And I'm a little bit of a slow learner, so you're going to see that I'm going to draw these lines from top to bottom. If I would have drawn them from bottom to top, I would have had my arrows going the correct way. I wouldn't have to flip them. But you see I have to click the little blue arrow to flip it when I cut profile. And there we go. Now I learned. So there's to set up cut profile, you can do a hotkey for that. And you'll see a little bit later in the video, I set up that hotkey. And it's a pretty handy shortcut. And a good tool to use when you're setting up details if you have a lot of the hatching patterns kind of pre-made into the massing that you created. And that really just helps save some time on details. What I'm doing here is I'm just adjusting these walls a little bit to be a little more accurate of a representation of what we see going on in the detail here. And then my cut depth here, I just want to bring that back so it doesn't create any lines that are distracting. One of the lines I do need to have is showing how the eave kind of angles in two different directions. And so this line that I just drew here represents the edge of that cross section of steel kind of carrying back and up. And I make it a grayed out line to help illustrate that it's kind of in the distance. So here I'm setting up the shortcut for cut profile because I was getting a little tired of moving my mouse up. So here's cut profile, and I end up doing XC. And so anytime I type in XC on the keyboard, now I can go and use cut profile. It's a little faster. Should have done that at the beginning. And also, I should be learning that if I click in the correct order, I won't have to flip the arrow. Okay, that's the detail line that I drew to represent the copper on the outside. So now I'm setting up this kind of bottom plate here for the steel framing. And we'll be doing the same in just a moment on the other side too. I like the create similar command a lot. I'm kind of a visual guy, so rather than navigating menus again, I'll take a look at what's nearby that I want to create again. I'll just click that real quick, right click and create similar. And instead of drawing detail lines around these hatched patterns, what I'm going to do is, or at least what I'm looking at doing right there, and what I have to do when I edit it, I can change the invisible lines on the boundaries to just be some thin lines. And now I have those boundaries. So it's all connected to the hatching pattern. Sometimes that works well. Sometimes it gets in the way and it's easier just to draw detail lines around things. All right, so we need the insulation inside that cavity. So you can do batt insulation like this, or you could do the rigid insulation. I think in the detail, it calls off for mineral wool. We'll see at the end of this what that ends up being. But if it was rigid, I would use the, for sure, I would be using the ortho crosshatch. All right, so now I'm going to be drawing the brackets that are hanging the material and supporting the material. The sheet goods to create the soffit. And I drew the first line I drew, I'm using as a center line, and then I'm just going to mirror over my work from the right side to the left side, and that'll create the thickness of the bracket. And the majority of this bracket is hidden lines. That's why I drew it up to there. And then I'm going to use just a regular thin line to create the head on the, it's like dowel that's hanging down. Just going to change that to a regular thin line at the end. And you can group detail lines when you're done, or you can even create a detail group to begin with. And I'm going to show that a little bit later as another method. So that's the dowel. Then you just have to come up with what your on-center spacing is, bring that across. Now, in the detail on the right from Detail Magazine, you see that there's a section that they have between the fascia and the actual exterior wall with the curtain wall. I didn't draw that break in here, so this part that I cut through wasn't that deep. And now from here, I'm drawing the other bracket that's coming down. This one's a little more substantial. And it goes up to the steel. What I also have at this point is a ceiling that's getting us the depth, and that ceiling is an acoustical panel that's suspended from these larger dowels. So we almost have this decking, right, that's creating the soffit that has insulation, right? It has rigidity and insulation. It's held by these shorter dowels. But then we have these brackets dropping these larger acoustical panels that are exposed, right, to the outside elements. It's sheltered. And this, so it doesn't really have to have much, water proofing properties, right? The roof above us is taking care of that. The fascia on the outside is taking care of shedding water with a drip edge. And so no water should be able to climb back up onto this material. Humidity in the air, I guess, depends on the climate, if you'd want that to be treated a different way. But in this detail, we see that the product is the same on the interior ceiling as coming out onto this covered patio. Here I'm just using the mirror command to just help get the top and bottom brackets the same. Okay, so I have that one, and I'm going to just group it as well. A little bit later, I believe I do that. All right, so now we're looking at what to do next. And there is another bracket that's inside of a piece of tube steel that then helps set the top of the curtain wall. You can see that with detail lines. We also see at the top, there's a bolted plate that then has a flange 90 degrees to it that helps secure the top of that wall. And that's above the curtain wall as well. And there's also an angle bracket that helps stop the curtain wall and the wall above from racking or changing position or angling. And so I'll end up drawing that in too. Here's the gypsum. And when you see two layers of gypsum, oftentimes it's going to be 5/8 type X for a 1 hour fire rating. And when you layer two, you achieve a 2 hour fire rating. So you see that going on here. And any delays you see or any hesitations you see, remember this is in double time, so I'm thinking twice as slow. That's just me looking at the detail and contemplating how I want to address it in Revit. Copying over, many different ways to do this. Probably should have got my length correct first before I copied over. Could also have mirrored. And here I'm just thinking about trying to center this up, making sure my widths are correct. Just kind of thinking through those things real quick. Ultimately, I decided that everything was good. Fine tuning, bringing these down. These are important details just because under the construction, right, we want to make sure everything's lapping correctly. We want to make sure that we're allowing room for expansion and contraction. You know, all of these little things add up and help communicate the way we want something constructed. Oftentimes, if you have good attention to detail, or you're kind of a perfectionist or very nitpicky, architecture is a good field for you. Or you like having control over things, that helps too. Because details are all about controlling the construction, right? Communicating clearly. All right, so I'm using my best guess here, and I think I end up sizing this down. I don't know the actual specs on this tube steel, but I do know that it's supposed to exist in about this same cavity here in between the gypsum. Drawing out the bracket. Just trying to line up midpoints. There we go. And then it needs to be hidden lines. That looks like it represents it. So we're good. And just going to create a group here. Okay. We have the top connection here. And so we have a piece of plate steel in section, and then looks like a couple of bolts, but I believe it's probably something a little bit more complicated than that. I wasn't able to find the exact type of fastener, I believe, in this detail. So I choose something that I think would be comparable. There must be, if you're a steel guy, please leave a comment, because there's probably a certain name for that type of fastener that's attaching this plate. I'm not sure if it's like a tension bolt or what, or some kind of like rivet, or not really sure. Dropping the gypsum down a little bit to allow room. You can see in the detail though that looks like the head on the one on the right is actually behind the gypsum and plywood in the detail. So I'm sure there's a little bit of flexibility here on how you illustrate that. Here I'm contemplating, right, which one's most similar. I think I end up going with like a carriage bolt. What's a little tricky on this detail, this part, is just getting the masking, right? I'm not trying to make it look like the section's cutting right through at where the bolts are. So I can bring easily the steel up in front, right? I don't want to hide everything because I want to see the top of the bolts above the bottom flange there on the steel. And so here I'm kind of wrestling with that. I'm just going to go and mask off a little box on that bottom flange thickness, so that way it hides the bolt going through that part. I bet I could also have done like a duplicate of those bolts right on top of each other, and layer them differently and throw the top part highest, maybe crop it. I don't know. There's probably different ways to do it. So if you have a better way, definitely leave a comment. This was one that you just kind of struggle with a little bit. And with these masking regions, sometimes they'll end up masking the lines that you want to show. Like I still want those edges, so I just want to bring them in a hair. That's what I end up doing. I find that works out pretty well, especially if you're zoomed out a bit. But if you're right on top of the line, it'll sometimes hide the line that you want to still show. So that's what I'm doing right there. I'm just bringing it down a little bit. Okay, that's looking almost good. Bring that to the front. There we go. Something like that. And then once that's all good, I'm going to end up grouping that. I also need to get the plate that's welded onto that other plate, which allows it to make that connection. Just masking off another region here. And here I'm realizing, oh yeah, I drew all of that, which is easy to move, but I drew all of that way too tall. So I'm like, all right, this curtain wall needs to drop down to about the ceiling's height. And I need to draw that wall that I have shrunk up there. I need to elongate that and bring all this down. And you'll see that this is relatively an easy fix. So what I'm doing is I'm setting up a ceiling here. Before I had actually just drawn just two detail components, or I might have even just done a detail line, a filled region. Basically what I'm doing is I'm creating an actual ceiling sketch here, so then that way I can snap the curtain wall up to it. So it would have been better if I had that ceiling in place at the very start of everything, but couldn't think of it all right off the bat. So just an iterative process here. But we're just bringing everything down. And before we know it, everything's all good. Grouping, copying over to get this bracket. So this is a gusset plate, and I'm drawing this in, just rotating it to match the pitch. And centering it, midpoint, midpoint. Okay, from there, it's a piece of tube steel. It's going to be on a, looks like about a 45-degree angle. So I'm just getting the other gusset plate in, but with this one, I'm just kind of using that same sizing as a reference for some detail lines that are going to be hidden. They're going to jump over it. So pick lines command and just throw those on. I should have locked them all, but just locked the one at the end. Now that's pretty much good. Let's just go and get the tube steel. I meant to get the side view. And possibly a little bit different size. So let's go pick that out. And just kind of get it roughed in. And from here, we'll get the angle right. And once we get the angle right, then it's really connecting it where we know it needs to be. In terms of touching the wall, and then drag the length to get it up to the steel. So drag that length, and then position the plate a little bit better, get the lapping that we want. I'm looking at just the top corner of that tube that's on an angle and how that meets about halfway on that plate. Okay, that looks about right. And then from there, looking to just get that angled bracket, that plate steel, to receive the other end in place. I should have just used detail line to draw that. It would have been easier. All right, now we need some through holes. So sizing those up. Something like a 3/4 diameter, so that'd be like a 3/8 radius. Looks about right. Once again, that is not specified on the drawings I'm going through. And keep in mind, all of this is conceptual, right? It's construction detail, but this is really tutorial on how to create construction details in Revit. Not necessarily that, no, this is the recipe, right? This is not the recipe necessarily for what you need in terms of what your structure needs to be built as. Largely depends on the climates that you're in, as well as local codes. And I'm noticing that I am short 2 layers of gypsum here. So I'm adding those in and readjusting. And that's just on the interior side, right? Okay. Now we're starting to get in a pretty good spot. A lot more of this goes smoother from here. Just looking for something with a little more depth. And I think I like that. What I want to do now is create a new custom line, new detail line. So you see I go into the manage and I'm creating a new line type. And I'm calling it membrane. And I'm going to choose a hidden line that's a little bit different than the other hidden line pattern. I think I might be choosing long dash, yeah. And I got my weight on that line to be a little thicker. And I'm going to draw the path that the membrane wraps. If I draw it right on top of the line, it's not very obvious. So I draw it just off, just like it's being papered or wrapped in real life. And we're just creating that whole waterproofing membrane around the envelope where it's being shown in the detail. So it comes up along the back side. And then it lands on top. And just a little bit of tweaking on positioning. And then it'll be all good. Here, I'm just drawing the gap here. Okay, so what you do see is line weight sometimes showing in spots you don't want to see it, a heavier line, let's say. So like the bottom of these acoustical panels, I don't like how thick that line weight is because technically the section is through the plywood that those fins for the acoustical panel are attached to. And so what I want to see are thin lines on the lowest part of that acoustical panel. And I'll end up doing that a little bit later on with a kind of a trick. This is a triple pane curtain wall. So center line, and then just using that. You'll see I make a few little tweaks on this after I draw it. Okay, so once I have the lines dividing up the glass to about what I'm happy with, not entirely happy with how I did that, but it's pretty close. Illustrates the point that there's multiple panes. You see that this curtain wall track actually drops a little bit lower than the foundation. And it's bolted into the foundation wall for that bottom connection. And then of course, I have to drag all these down to get that right. So I'm using this expansion bolt, it's like a wedge anchor. Using the join command. And then view, cut profile, and detail line, and we'll get the correct thickness going across the top. There we go. All right, so that layer that you see that I just detailed out on the inside, that's the polished white concrete aggregate. That's like a skim coat on top of the structural concrete for the floor. And I think I'm just experimenting with a little bit smaller of a size here on the angle iron. Okay. So I'm deciding if I'm happy with it. I am. I'm going to use detail line here. Sketch this pin. And we'll use detail line as well to draw out this bracket. Using my shortcuts XC, a custom shortcut from before in the video to do view cut profile. So this is the repetitive detail component. So patio pavers, granite. Could do a cut pattern on it. That's one way to approach it, but I think what looks cool is this repetitive detail. So I'm going to do the pattern and then I change my mind. I'm like, I want to show how to do a repetitive detail as well. So I'll add that in right after I throw in a hatching pattern that I thought could have been okay. Looking for like a stone pattern that I want to load. And I'm just going to go and place it, and then I'm going to get rid of it. So I want one that's 3 inches thick, about 2 foot wide. And so I'll have to edit, make my own. And so once I have that, now I'm ready to create a repetitive detail component. So now I'm editing the duplicating and renaming the brick repetitive detail, which is kind of like a template to then create the granite paver detail. And I loaded in that family. And I'm going to go and place it, and my initial spacing between pavers is off. So I have to fix that. Right now it's at the brick. So I have to do 2 feet, and I'll just draw it this way. And I want to get a full brick over on the left. So I draw it a little long until I get that next full brick. And I'm just going to slide them over to the right. Okay. So now we have the granite pavers in place. There's this little channel that's cut in. Once again, like at one point in the project, electrical runs through there for like a little countertop seating. In this section, it's more so just about running heat. And so there's just this channel cut out for some HVAC. So I'm creating this channel with just a masking region. And then from there, we're going to layer in the component details on top. Navigating menus for one of the smallest angles that I can find. Looking at about 1.5 by 2. Is that what I chose? 1.5 by 1.5 by 1.5, I think. No, 2.5 by 1.5. And with those in place, Looking for a track. Runner channel, I think I choose there. And that'll create a tray for the radiant piping. Some of these adjustments that I'm making, there's no measurements I have to go off of, but I'm just using just scale and proportion. When you do the piping, you could also do an offset inner wall and just choose a thin line for that. And I'll make that exterior line look even a little thicker. And here I'm messing with hidden lines for the anchor bolt that's going into the wall. I know it needs to be like a hidden line there, but I need it to be a little bit tighter of a hidden line to show correctly at this scale. Their detail, they don't show a keyed wall into a footing. I end up drawing one here. I think I get rid of that later. They don't actually, they show it as like one solid foundation wall to footing. So it could have been one monolithic pour in their construction. So I took away the key, but you could just key it out with joining it and then doing detail line over it. Or another way is you do a view cut profile and you can cut that key profile in on that footing. So we're looking at the cut line pattern. You can override the actual pattern if you wanted to, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do the line weight to 1. Now I can just go and manipulate all the lines that I want to manipulate. So everything will come in as a thin line. And then from there, I can just trace over where I want the wide lines and medium line thicknesses to be. So most of that's good. And there I'm just cleaning up the mess behind the aggregate and the grate for above that floor. Right there, I just did a view cut profile. Now at this point, I want to annotate in the view, then bring the view into a sheet. And annotating in this view, what I'm doing here is I'm creating one annotation, and then I'm going to copy that down. I also want to really lock in the scale that I believe this drawing is going to end up at before annotating everything as well, just so when I change my scale, my text size stays the same and I don't want a ton of overlapping. So at this point, we're just kind of dialing in what we want our text to look like graphically, size-wise. You know, what do we want the end of those annotation lines to look like? How big do we want them to be? And then what is our scale going to be for the view? Once we have all that set, we're just going to go and copy a bunch of them down. And that is a little shortcut, little hack to just keep everything aligned nicely. We'll edit the text later and we'll edit where the leader lines are pointing to. But it's nice to have uniform spacing, and it's also nice to have all the text start in the same spot in terms of left to right here. So that way it's easy for our eyes to land on where the next item is going to be. Okay, now we're ready to draw in a filled region for the ground. So if you hit tab with pick lines, you can quickly grab pre-selected lines that Revit intuitively will come up with. And so that's how I got that perimeter real quick around the bottom between the flooring and the footing. And then Revit has a earth hatch, so I'm just choosing that. Okay, so that's the last thing that I want to call out here on this detail. Now we're ready to put this into a sheet. Sheet placement right here on this sheet. I plan on having a couple extra views as well. So initially I place this thing centered, and then I start thinking about adding in some different views to help explain this view a little bit further, such as where the sections cut in plan. So throwing in a little key plan next to it, I thought would be nice for this sheet to operate a little bit more independently from, let's say, the rest of a set of drawings. And the 500 series is what I'm familiar with for putting in details. So I name it A501. I'm just calling it wall section. And then from here, I ended up putting in a couple other views as well. So the rest of this is really just throwing in those additional views on the sheet, scaling them, make sure the graphics show correctly. If you'd like the project file, check out the link below and visit studiohero.co for more.